President Biden conceding last week that the U.S. is going to be needing oil and gas for, as he says, at least the next decade as the country transitions to renewables. But our next guest says that we are not in the midst of an energy transition and claims the so-called climate crisis is overblown. Last month, he railed against what he called an alarmist move away from fossil fuels in a video on LinkedIn. The Microsoft-owned company removed the post, citing misinformation, only put it back up days later. So let's talk to Chris Wright right now, Chairman and CEO of Liberty Energy, North America's second largest fracking company. Chris, good morning to you. Let's start with your reaction. I imagine you're watching the State of the Union. You see President Biden, and he makes the statement actually twice, if you recall. In fact, the first time he says we're going to need fossil fuels for a while, and then later follows up with we're going to need it for, I think he said something like, about a decade. And of course, there were laughter in the chamber, I imagine, from the GOP, but it might have very well been both sides of the aisle at that point.
Yeah, likely it was. Of course, it's great to see an acknowledgement. The world runs on oil and gas, and we need that. But yeah, to throw out a decade, it's just an absurd time frame. We're not going to meaningfully change the demand for oil and gas one way or the other in the next decade. And I think politicizing energy and opposing infrastructure, sort of standing in the way of today's energy system before we built a new energy system, there's just no upside in that.
So when you think about the timeline, what do you think is a realistic timeline to the degree you think there is one?
I mean, it's multi-generations. If you look at the Energy Information Administration, right, our government agency that projects forward demands for varied energy sources, they have roughly flat demand for oil and gas in 2050 than what we have today. Maybe it rises a little bit in the next decade or two. Maybe it comes down a little bit in the next decade or two after that. And maybe that's true. But I don't think you'll see meaningful change of our hydrocarbon system in the next 3 decades. I'm all for investing in new energy sources. Nuclear has a great future if we could regulatorily issue a permit. We haven't issued a new permit for a nuclear plant in 50 years. So there's great new things we can bring, but standing in the way of what runs the world today just isn't productive.
I'm a big fan, it's quite unpopular, of talking about nuclear energy. Usually when I say something on the air, it causes some kind of strange firestorm. Do you think there's any realistic chance that we have nuclear energy in the United States in the next decade?
I think probably not in the next decade. Nuclear, I think, will start a renaissance right now, but it more likely starts it overseas with just sort of a less onerous and less fear-driven regulatory system. I think we'll see small modular reactors come. What's great about nuclear is they bring not just electricity, which is the only place wind and solar can play. Electricity is less than a quarter of global energy. Process heat that you need for manufacturing is just critical. Nuclear could bring process heat as well as electricity. Today, that's just fossil fuels that bring process heat.
Chris, the other thing I wanted to ask you two big other questions. One was, the SEC has been pushing for more disclosure for companies around ESG and in particular their plans around climate and energy. It seems like that's going to get softened in part because of the comments that have come back to them. We talked to Gary Gensler from the SEC on Friday. What is your sense of what the SEC was proposing and where you think they're going to land?
Well, what they proposed is totally nuts, and I wrote a long comment letter on it. A lot of public company CEOs won't do that. But just making an enormously complicated, expensive reporting thing so people can sue us because they think we didn't quite properly estimate our Scope 3 emissions, which is the products we produce, someone else burning them on the other side of the world or on the other side of the country. Like, no one can really account for that. Why are they doing that? They're doing it so this administration can signal they're against fossil fuels. Chris, that's just, again, unproductive.
When your LinkedIn post went down, tell me what happened. People talk about censorship all the time. Who should be the arbiter of truth and all of that?
Yeah, crazy. Yeah, I mean, I made a sort of an amateur video, but just talking about energy, climate, transition, just some basic data so you can get background on it. And it was taken down for misinformation. I hit the appeal the decision button and they came back and said it violated their spams and scams policy. Posted it again, was taken down again for misinformation, and then upon appeal, they said, sorry, on further review, it didn't violate their policy. Now, that's probably not LinkedIn, but people are complaining because I'm not talking the climate alarmist narrative. And then for LinkedIn to go along and take that down, it's just a symbol of where we are today. It's unfortunate.
So, Chris, when we finally hit peak production again, we haven't yet since I think it was 2019. So there's a lot of finger pointing on why that is. I mean, fracking had its own problems, during when there was a slow period. When we try to reopen from a pandemic, we can't get the workers that we need for the whole industry, the oil and gas industry. But add in ESG and add in President Biden's pitch that I will, read my lips, I will end the fossil fuel industry. How much do you think ESG and that type of rhetoric scared away producers? Is that part of it, a large part of it? And net, is ESG a positive or negative for society, do you think?
I think from an investor movement, it's a negative. Of course, we should care about the environment and the societies we operate in. And of course, company government should be aligned with the owners of businesses. That's a very real point. The other two is, of course, but that's what businesses do in a free society. If you're not a great member of society, if people don't believe they're part of something bigger than just getting a paycheck, you're going to have trouble getting workers. So the idea is right, but it's really become sort of a top-down. If you're emitting greenhouse gas emissions, you're bad. If you're reducing them or shrinking your business there, you're good. And then, of course, a top-down checkbox list to decide if we're socially virtuous or not. These are bad ideas. Investors should care about ESG, but it shouldn't be like a third party come up with a scorecard and tell me who's virtuous and who's not. And on the margin, Joe, it has indeed reduced capital to our industry, raises the cost of capital.
Okay.
On the margin, absolutely, we produce less oil and gas because of it. And the main impact of that is higher oil and gas prices.